You call it overthinking. You think it's your mind being annoying. You wish you could shut it off, the mental noise, the looping thoughts, the way you replay moments that don't matter anymore, or maybe mattered too much. You try to distract yourself, to stay busy, to breathe through it, but it always returns, stronger, louder, smarter, like a warning. But for what? You scroll past productivity hacks, read about mindfulness, try meditating for 3 minutes before quitting. But the truth is, none of it touches the real reason, because you're not just thinking too much. You're remembering something you never really processed. You're trying to fix something without knowing what broke. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, two minds who shaped how we understand ourselves, believed that thinking isn't always thinking. Sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's avoidance, and sometimes it's grief. Freud saw obsessive thought as a symptom, the mind's way of holding on to what it couldn't accept or couldn't let surface. Jung saw it as a map, a clue that the conscious mind is out of sync with what's happening underneath. So what if your overthinking isn't random? What if it's a strategy your mind developed to keep you from feeling something it believes you can't handle? Shame, rejection, loss, failure, fear, something that happened before, maybe even long before you had words for it, that taught your mind the world isn't safe, that you're not enough, that something in you needs to be constantly on guard. And now, your brain replays conversations, imagines disasters, prepares comebacks to things that haven't happened, because it's trying to make sure you're never caught off guard again. That's not overthinking, that's survival. It's your nervous system trying to do its job, to protect you, even if it has to exhaust you to do it. But here's the trap. The more your mind tries to protect you, the more it convinces you that danger is everywhere. And so the cycle continues. You can't relax, because relaxing feels vulnerable. You can't stop thinking, because stopping feels unsafe. You can't let go, because letting go feels like losing control. So you stay in your head, because it feels safer than being in your body, safer than feeling, safer than remembering. But safety isn't peace, and thinking isn't healing. At some point, you have to ask, what is my mind really afraid of? Because until you know that, you'll keep mistaking protection for a problem and calling yourself broken, when really, you've just been in survival mode for far too long. Freud believed that the human mind is built like an iceberg. What you see, your thoughts, decisions, personality, is just the surface. Beneath it lies something far more powerful, the unconscious. And the unconscious isn't quiet. It speaks, not with words, but with patterns, with feelings you can't explain, with reactions that seem out of proportion, with thoughts that won't leave you alone. Freud called these defense mechanisms unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect you from pain. You've heard of some of them: repression, pushing painful memories out of awareness; projection, seeing in others what you can't face in yourself; displacement, transferring emotion from one place to another, like yelling at someone because you're angry with yourself. But there's one defense that hides in plain sight: intellectualization. It's when your mind wraps emotion in thought. It analyzes instead of feels. It turns pain into puzzles. And suddenly, you're not feeling sad. You're thinking about why you feel sad. You're not heartbroken. You're dissecting attachment theory. You're not angry. You're Googling the neuroscience of rage. This is the clever defense of overthinkers. They don't run from emotion. They study it. They try to understand it so deeply that maybe, just maybe, they won't have to feel it. But here's the paradox. The more you intellectualize emotion, the more you disconnect from it. And the more you disconnect from it, the louder it becomes, echoing through your mind, disguised as thought. So you stay stuck, looping, reframing, reprocessing, and all the while, your body waits. For the moment, you'll stop thinking and start feeling. For the moment, you'll stop solving and start listening. Jung went further. He believed that overthinking is often the psyche's way of compensating for what the soul has been denied. When your inner world is fragmented, when there's a gap between who you are and who you pretend to be, your thoughts become louder, because silence would expose too much. Stillness would reveal the parts you've buried, the fear, the grief, the unmet needs, the child in you who's still waiting to be acknowledged. So your mind keeps moving, and you call it intelligence, you call it awareness, but maybe it's avoidance, not of reality, but of yourself. Because if you slow down, what might rise to the surface? What emotion? What memory? What truth? These are the questions that overthinking protects you from, and the answers that healing invites you toward. But that journey doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body, in the places you've been afraid to feel. At some point, the thinking gets heavy. You start to feel the weight of your own mind, not just the thoughts themselves, but what they're trying to protect you from. And that's where the shift begins. Because healing doesn't start with answers. It starts with a pause, a moment where you stop chasing clarity through thought and start creating space for truth to emerge without it. It's terrifying at first. You're used to understanding things, labeling them, controlling them. But there's a difference between control and clarity. One keeps you in your head, the other reconnects you to yourself. Jung believed that we find wholeness not by avoiding our shadow, but by integrating it, by turning toward the parts we were taught to suppress. And overthinking often signals exactly where the shadow lives, the places you overanalyze the most. That's where your truth is hiding, in the fear of rejection, in the ache for control, in the longing to be understood without explaining yourself. Your thoughts spiral because your emotions are trapped, not because you're broken, but because you've never been given a safe place to let them move. And so, the mind tries to compensate. It creates meaning to protect you from feeling meaningless. It plans to protect you from unpredictability. It replays, rechecks, re-examines, because it's terrified of what happens if it lets go. But what if letting go is the very thing your mind is craving? Not letting go of responsibility, not letting go of intelligence, letting go of the illusion that you can think your way into peace. Because peace isn't a thought, it's a nervous system that finally feels safe. Freud once said that the goal of therapy is to turn neurotic misery into ordinary human unhappiness. But maybe the goal is bigger than that. Maybe the goal is to remember that we're not just minds, we're bodies, hearts, instincts, and no amount of thinking will replace the feeling of being fully alive. So what do? You don't silence the thoughts. You listen to what they're trying to say. You trace them back, not to the most logical explanation, but to the most honest emotion. Because beneath every spiral is a story, one you've probably been trying to avoid, not because you're weak, but because you never felt safe enough to tell it. Real healing doesn't ask you to silence your mind. It asks you to slow down enough to understand it, because the truth is, your mind isn't your enemy. It's not trying to sabotage you. It's trying to protect you, with the only tools it's ever known: preparation, prediction, prevention. But what your mind calls safety, your body might call exhaustion. And at some point, you begin to feel the cost. The tension that lives in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the inability to relax, even when nothing's wrong. This is what happens when thought outruns emotion, when you use logic to outrun what your body already knows. Jung believed that integration, the uniting of conscious and unconscious, is the path to becoming whole. And that path doesn't begin with insight. It begins with presence. Not thinking about your past, not planning your future, but actually being here, in this moment, with all its discomfort, stillness, and unfamiliar quiet. And it's in that quiet that something starts to shift. Not all at once, not dramatic way, but in small, honest ways. You notice when a thought isn't helpful, and you let it go. You feel a familiar spiral start, and you pause, breathe, and stay. You stop trying to control every outcome, and begin to trust your capacity to respond. This isn't passivity, it's power. Because for the first time, your choices aren't driven by fear, but grounded in awareness. You begin to ask new questions. Not, what's wrong with me? But what does this part of me need? Not, how do I shut this thought down? But what emotion is it trying to protect? And little by little, you learn to meet your mind with compassion, not criticism. You stop labeling yourself as broken. You stop identifying with your patterns. You stop believing the lie that thinking more will save you. Because it's not more thinking that brings peace. It's more connection to your body, to your truth, to the parts of you that were never meant to be intellectualized, only felt. You realize that thoughts are just messengers, and that they only scream when they're not being heard. Because beneath the noise, beneath the loops, beneath the constant spinning, there's always something quieter. A moment that never got closure, a need that never got met, a part of you that never got to speak. And that's what overthinking is, the sound of a self that's still waiting to be heard. Jung believed that the psyche's job is not just to function, it's to become whole. But wholeness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from integration, from letting every part of you have a seat at the table, even the ones that make you uncomfortable, especially those. So maybe your mind isn't malfunctioning. Maybe it's doing the best it can with the silence you gave it, filling in the gaps, trying to solve the unsolvable, holding space for pain you never felt ready to feel. And maybe it's time you took the weight off, not by forcing your thoughts to stop, but by starting to feel the things they've been protecting you from. Because thoughts don't need to be shut down. They need to be seen, so they can soften, so they can settle, so they can finally rest. Freud taught us that unexpressed emotion never dies. It gets buried alive and comes back in uglier forms. Jung showed us that those forms have meaning, and if we follow them, they lead us back to the parts we lost. And maybe that's what this was always about. Not thinking too much, but feeling too little. Not because you didn't want to, but because no one ever taught you how. And now you know that every spiral, every storm, every sleepless night was never proof of failure. It was proof that your mind has been working overtime to keep you from falling apart. But maybe you don't need to be held together anymore. Maybe it's okay to unravel a little, to listen, to breathe, to feel, to let the mind rest and the soul speak. Because the goal was never to stop thinking. The goal was to finally feel safe enough that you don't have to.